Today, I want to speak about something incredibly powerful: silence, or more specifically, knowing when to zip your mouth. We live in a world addicted to noise, verbal noise, digital noise, internal chatter. But science shows us that restraint, not reaction, is often where true strength lies. When you hold back from speaking impulsively, you activate areas of the brain associated with executive control, specifically the prefrontal cortex. This is the same region that governs focus, discipline, and long-term planning. In moments of silence, your nervous system is better able to process, evaluate, and respond instead of react. Zipping your mouth isn't about weakness or submission. It's about tactical awareness. When you speak, you're broadcasting. When you listen, you're gathering intelligence. It's in silence that the brain decodes emotion, context, and motive. You miss that when you talk too much. Physiologically, silence activates the parasympathetic nervous system. That means lowered cortisol, reduced heart rate, and improved cognitive performance. The act of not reacting actually makes you more resilient. And here's the truth: every word you say either builds trust or breaks it. Silence gives space for your words to gain weight. If you're always talking, nothing you say will matter. But if you choose your words with intention, people will lean in when you finally speak. So zip your mouth when you're angry, when you're unsure, when you're being baited, because silence is not passive. It's active self-regulation. It's mastery of mind, breath, and behavior. When you choose not to speak, especially in moments of stress, confrontation, or uncertainty, you're engaging one of the most powerful parts of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. This area, located right behind your forehead, plays a central role in executive function. That means it's responsible for your ability to plan, delay gratification, and suppress impulsive behaviors. When you pause instead of reacting, you give this region the opportunity to take over from more primitive areas of the brain that drive emotion, like the amygdala. There's a measurable shift in neural activity when you resist the urge to respond immediately. Instead of allowing reflexive circuits to dominate, you engage the networks involved in top-down control. This top-down processing allows you to assess not just what's happening, but what it means, and how best to respond in a way that aligns with long-term goals rather than short-term emotional release. The act of self-silencing doesn't mean shutting down. It means opening up higher cognitive channels. It's not about withdrawal. It's about direction. By holding back speech, you're training the brain to operate from a place of thoughtful evaluation rather than reactive emotion. Over time, this builds stronger connectivity in circuits associated with discipline, focus, and emotional regulation. Put simply, every moment you choose to stay quiet when you could have lashed out is a kind of workout for your brain's control center. It strengthens your ability to pause, reflect, and lead, internally and externally. Speaking less creates space in the brain's limited cognitive workspace. Every time you speak, especially without intention, you're drawing on working memory, attentional systems, and emotional regulation circuits. These systems are not infinite, they have a load limit. When you engage in unnecessary verbal output, you occupy cognitive resources that could otherwise be allocated toward deeper processing, observation, or decision-making. By reducing verbal output, you reduce neural noise. That allows for more efficient signaling between brain regions, especially between the prefrontal cortex and areas involved in focus, planning, and memory. You begin to notice more, retain more, and process faster because the system isn't overloaded by constant output demands. Speaking less also minimizes the pressure to multitask between thought formulation and speech execution. That means more neural energy is directed inward toward clarity and strategic thinking, rather than outward in managing social expression. The result is improved cognitive throughput, essentially more mental bandwidth for tasks that actually matter. Silence, then, is not just the absence of sound, it's the deliberate conservation of brain power. When you choose not to speak unnecessarily, you're reallocating limited neural resources from expression to perception, from reaction to reflection, and from surface interaction to deeper cognitive function. That's a powerful shift, and one that shows up in enhanced learning, memory consolidation, and emotional intelligence over time. Silence, when practiced with intention, initiates a fundamental shift in the body's internal state, specifically a transition from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance. This is not a vague psychological phenomenon. It is a measurable, biologically driven process that affects virtually every organ system. At the core of this shift is the vagus nerve, a major component of the parasympathetic nervous system that originates in the brainstem and extends through the neck and into the chest and abdomen, regulating heart rate, digestion, immune function, and even emotional expression. When you are silent, particularly in a setting where you would normally speak, argue, or assert yourself, you suppress activity in circuits of the brain that are associated with arousal and defense. The sympathetic nervous system, responsible for fight or flight responses, tends to dominate during periods of stress, confrontation, or uncertainty. This state is metabolically expensive and marked by increased heart rate, elevated cortisol levels, faster breathing, and narrow focus. In many cases, speaking, especially when emotionally charged, amplifies this response, reinforcing a loop of physiological stress and reactive behavior. But when you consciously choose silence in these moments, you interrupt that loop. You remove fuel from the fire. Neural activity begins to shift toward regions of the brain associated with interoception and self-regulation, like the anterior cingulate cortex and insula. You are no longer broadcasting outward. Instead, your system begins to listen inward. The act of silence becomes a behavioral signal that tells the brain no threat is present, no action is required, and recovery can begin. As this signal is interpreted by the nervous system, parasympathetic activation increases, heart rate slows, breathing deepens, and the body moves into a state of restoration. Importantly, this is not the same as dissociation or freezing. Those are defensive responses. This is a state of active recovery, where energy is conserved and redirected toward processes like cellular repair, memory consolidation, and immune readiness. The relationship between silence and parasympathetic tone is also supported by changes in heart rate variability, HRV, a reliable biomarker of autonomic flexibility. Higher HRV is correlated with greater capacity to respond adaptively to stress in periods of intentional silence, especially when combined with nasal breathing or stillness, consistently lead to improved HRV metrics. In practical terms, this means that people who engage in regular, intentional silence show improved resilience, not just emotionally, but neurologically and physiologically. It's important to understand that this effect is dose-dependent and context-dependent. A few seconds of silence can initiate a shift, but longer periods, minutes to hours, can create more lasting neuroplastic changes. Over time, repeated engagement in silent states strengthens the neural pathways associated with self-regulation, which means that the brain becomes more efficient at switching out of stress and into calm. This is not about suppressing expression. It's about building the internal capacity to choose expression wisely, from a state of internal alignment. In modern environments where constant verbal output and digital noise are normalized, silence becomes a form of neural resistance. It's not merely the absence of talking, it's the presence of restoration. It's a recalibration tool for the autonomic nervous system, one that promotes equilibrium and strengthens the circuitry involved in calm, focus, and resilience. The simple choice to remain silent, especially in high-stakes or emotionally charged moments, is not a withdrawal from life. It's a strategic, biologically intelligent act of engagement with your internal state. Silence isn't empty. It's filled with physiological change. It's a signal, subtle but powerful, that says to your body and mind you are safe, you are capable, and you can return to baseline. In that space, clarity emerges. And from clarity, everything else follows. Verbal restraint, deliberately choosing not to speak impulsively, has a profound impact on how the brain regulates one of its most essential neurotransmitters, dopamine. While most people associate dopamine with reward and pleasure, its true function is far more nuanced. Dopamine is fundamentally about motivation, anticipation, and the pursuit of outcomes. It determines what we pay attention to, how much effort we're willing to expend, and how emotionally invested we become in a given moment. When we speak impulsively, especially in emotionally charged situations, we are often chasing a fast, low-effort dopamine spike. There's a brief sense of release, validation, or control that comes from expressing a strong opinion, interrupting, or reacting defensively. That verbal outburst becomes a kind of reward loop. The brain links the act of speaking with immediate emotional relief or dominance. But the problem is that these quick hits of dopamine are unsustainable. Over time, the reward system becomes dysregulated. The threshold for satisfaction rises, the baseline drops, and the brain begins to crave more stimulation just to feel normal. That's the essence of dopamine depletion. When small, reactive behaviors constantly hijack the system, the long-term capacity for motivation and self-control diminishes. Verbal restraint interrupts that loop. By choosing not to speak, particularly in moments where speaking would deliver instant gratification, you deny yourself a cheap dopamine hit. And while that may feel uncomfortable at first, something critical happens neurologically. You engage what's called top-down control, a process driven by the prefrontal cortex. This region of the brain inhibits the reactive midbrain structures that generate impulsive speech and emotional outbursts. With repeated practice, this inhibition becomes stronger and more efficient, which directly contributes to healthier dopamine regulation. What's happening here is not just about self-control, it's about recalibrating the brain's reward prediction system. Dopamine isn't released when a reward is received, it's released in anticipation of a reward. So, when you restrain from speaking, you delay gratification. That delay increases the reward value of future actions, especially when those actions are intentional and well-timed. You start to train your brain to associate value with thoughtful expression, rather than impulsive reaction. Over time, that shift enhances your overall dopamine sensitivity. You no longer need the constant stimulation of expressing every thought or emotion. You begin to find greater satisfaction in waiting, observing, and choosing your moment. This kind of restraint also changes the neurochemical dynamics of social interaction. Speaking less and listening more increases social feedback and novelty, which are both powerful modulators of dopamine release. People respond more positively to individuals who speak with intention and timing. Their words carry more weight, and that feedback loop creates a deeper, more sustainable form of social reward, one that promotes connection rather than dominance or distraction. There's also a metabolic component. Dopamine synthesis depends on a balance of neural resources, including the availability of tyrosine and cofactors like iron and B vitamins. Chronic impulsive behavior, especially verbal impulsivity, can drive up systemic stress, increase cortisol, and deplete these metabolic reserves. Verbal restraint, by contrast, reduces stress signaling, stabilizes metabolic demand, and preserves the biochemical conditions necessary for optimal dopamine function. In essence, every time you choose silence over impulsive speech, you're making a neurochemical investment. You're lowering your brain's dependence on external fast-acting stimuli and reinforcing its capacity for sustained, internally driven motivation. You're moving from a reactive dopamine system to a regulated, goal-directed one. That shift is subtle but powerful. It changes how you think, how you feel, how you interact, and ultimately, how you live. So while verbal restraint may seem like a behavioral choice on the surface, it's actually a deeply neurochemical strategy. It's about harnessing the machinery of motivation itself, not by feeding it impulsively, but by training it to operate with clarity, patience, and purpose. That's when dopamine becomes a tool, not a trap. Listening, genuine, present, and deliberate listening, engages the brain in ways that go far beyond the passive reception of sound. At the center of this process is a brain region known as the insula, or more specifically, the tinsular cortex, nestled deep within the folds of the brain, plays a pivotal role in interoception, the brain's perception of the internal state of the body, as well as in emotional awareness, empathy, and self-regulation. When you actively listen, particularly in emotionally charged or socially complex situations, the insula becomes significantly more active. That activation isn't random. It reflects an intricate interplay between perception, emotion, and physiological awareness. When someone else is speaking and you're truly listening, not rehearsing your reply, not waiting for your turn to interrupt, but really attending to their words, tone, and expression, you're essentially placing your nervous system in a receptive mode. This mode requires the integration of multiple sensory streams: auditory input from their voice, visual input from their face and body language, and emotional input from the content and tone of what's being said. The insular cortex sits at the crossroads of all these signals. It acts like a conductor, coordinating incoming information with internal physiological states, heart rate, breath rhythm, and even micro-adjustments in posture and muscle tone. What makes this so powerful is that the insula doesn't just process what's happening externally, it helps you feel it. This is why deep listening can trigger subtle but real bodily changes. Your heart rate might adjust. Your breathing may slow or sync with the other person's cadence. This is not imagination. These are measurable autonomic shifts orchestrated through the insular cortex's connection to the vagus nerve and the broader autonomic nervous system. In a very real sense, listening is a whole-body experience mediated by the brain's ability to fuse internal awareness with external perception. But it goes deeper. The insula is also heavily involved in empathy. Not the abstract idea of it, but the biological mechanism of it. When someone shares a story, especially one that involves pain, fear, or joy, your insula helps you simulate that experience internally. This doesn't happen when you're talking over them or preparing your argument. It happens when you're silent and attentive. That's when mirror neurons engage, emotional circuits activate, and your brain begins to mirror aspects of the speaker's state. That mirroring, which is largely coordinated through the insula, is what allows connection to occur, not just cognitively, but somatically. Now, what's interesting is that this kind of insula-driven listening doesn't just benefit the speaker, it rewires the listener. Every time you practice deep listening, you enhance the insula's sensitivity. Neuroplasticity is experience-dependent. This means the more often you engage in this receptive, embodied listening mode, the better your brain becomes at detecting subtle cues, regulating internal responses, and empathizing with others in real time. This isn't just a psychological trait, it's a trained physiological skill. And it comes with broad-spectrum benefits, better relationships, lower reactivity, enhanced intuition, and a more accurate sense of the present moment. In contrast, when you're talking excessively, especially from a place of ego or emotional reactivity, the brain shifts away from insular processing and toward regions like the amygdala and motor cortex, areas involved in defense and expression rather than reception and integration. This shift can be useful in short bursts, but over time it creates a feedback loop where your internal awareness dulls and your sensitivity to others declines. You may still be communicating, but you're no longer connecting. The bridge between nervous systems weakens. Listening, especially from an embodied place, restores that bridge. It brings your nervous system back into alignment with the rhythms of the moment and the state of the other person. So when you choose to listen rather than speak, you're not doing less, you're doing more, but in a different way. You're activating high-level brain systems responsible for empathy, regulation, and social attunement. You're engaging the insula, one of the most integrative structures in the human brain, and by doing so, you're enhancing your capacity for awareness, not just of others, but of yourself. That's the paradox. Silence from your mouth creates activity in your mind, and not just random activity, but deeply tuned, deeply human engagement with the present moment. That's what listening is, not passive, but powerful. Not absence, but alignment. A neurological posture of openness, driven by the insula, that allows you to perceive more, understand more, and ultimately connect more. Impulse speech, those moments when we blurt something out, interrupt, lash out, or rush to fill a silence, is typically not a product of conscious, reflective thought. Instead, it originates from deep structures in the brain that evolved to detect threat, assert dominance, and seek immediate resolution, the limbic system. This collection of ancient brain areas, including the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and others, is tightly coupled to our emotional reactivity and survival instincts. When you're speaking from impulse, you're not speaking from the part of your brain that's designed for reasoning. You're speaking from the part that's designed for each reacting. Let's look at how this works. The amygdala, for example, is a central hub in the limbic system responsible for detecting emotional salience, especially fear, anger, and threat. It doesn't wait for facts, it acts fast. If someone says something that challenges your identity, contradicts your values, or makes you feel insecure, the amygdala lights up within milliseconds. That activation bypasses the slower, more deliberate circuits in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, empathy, and judgment. The result? You speak before you think. This pathway is not random, it's evolutionarily conserved. In the context of survival, fast reaction had a functional purpose. If you were threatened verbally or physically, reacting instantly could have protected you. But in modern environments, like a workplace conversation, a disagreement with a partner, or a tense negotiation, those same circuits can become maladaptive. The problem isn't that you feel something quickly. The problem is that the verbal expression of that feeling hijacks the conversation and often sabotages your deeper goals. When impulse speech is limbic-driven, it tends to be emotionally loaded, poorly structured, and disproportionate to the situation. That's because it's governed by fast, bottom-up neural signaling. Emotional input comes first. And only later, sometimes seconds or minutes later, does the rational brain catch up. In fact, there are measurable delays in prefrontal activation following strong limbic stimulation. During this gap, if you're speaking, you're essentially narrating your emotional state in real time, without the benefit of regulation, reflection, or strategy. There's also a hormonal component. Limbic-driven speech is often accompanied by a surge in stress hormones, particularly cortisol and norepinephrine. These chemicals amplify emotional tone, narrow your focus, and push your nervous system into a reactive state. Your voice may become louder, your speech faster, your language more aggressive or defensive. You're not engaging in dialogue, you're broadcasting a distress signal. And once that signal is out, it has consequences on relationships, credibility, and internal homeostasis. Neuroscientifically, impulse speech represents a failure of top-down control. Ideally, the prefrontal cortex would modulate the signals from the limbic system, allowing emotion to be felt but not immediately expressed. This kind of regulation requires milliseconds of delay, just enough to insert choice between stimulus and response. But when you're exhausted, emotionally triggered, or untrained in restraint, the prefrontal cortex can become functionally offline. That's when the limbic system takes the wheel and words come out before context, clarity, or consequence are considered. Now, over time, if impulsive speech becomes habitual, it rewires the brain. The circuits that support reactivity become more efficient through repetition, a concept known as Hebbian plasticity, on neurons that fire together, wire together. This means the more often you speak from emotion rather than intention, the more automatic that pattern becomes. Your brain begins to treat emotional outburst as a default response. And with each repetition, it becomes harder to reclaim the pause needed for regulation. But the good news is that this process is reversible. Neuroplasticity goes both ways. Choosing silence in moments of internal intensity, especially when the urge to speak is strongest, acts as a neural intervention. It interrupts the limbic prefrontal feedback loop and begins to build new circuitry, one that favors observation, delay, and intention. Each act of verbal restraint strengthens inhibitory pathways in the prefrontal cortex, allowing for greater control over limbic output in future situations. This isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about creating a neurological buffer between emotion and expression, a buffer that allows for strategic, meaningful communication rather than reactive discharge. Over time, that buffer becomes automatic. You feel the rise of emotion, you notice the urge to speak, but instead of acting, you observe. In that pause, something powerful happens, awareness comes online. And from awareness, agency is born.